I haven't been utilizing that, so I'm going to try to start.
Numbers tick upward.
Yeah, people are joining very quickly now. It's good.
Great. Okay, well, it's officially noon in the Boston area, so we can get started. Again, welcome. We've left some messages in the chat to your right. If you are just joining, please mute on the bottom left. And again, welcome. This is, I'm not sure where we are in our numbers of necessary conversations now, but I think this is at least our third or fourth for spring. We're here today with Ed Freeman. I'm really excited to have you join us, Ed. Thank you again so much. This is an initiative of the International Humanistic Management Association. We had hoped, starting from about 2 or 3 years ago, to have a forum where we could have these types of conversations with people who are interested in having them, and so far this has been pretty successful. Actually, Ed is one of our most popular necessary conversations today. We're thrilled for Ed to be here. We have a number of other activities going on, and you're certainly welcome to go visit the website, which is humanisticmanagement.international. That's also where you will find the recording of this necessary conversations in coming days. I'm going to turn this over to David Wasilewski, who will introduce Ed and have a really, I think, engaging chat with Ed. And then we'll do Q&A, which we will moderate from the chat box. So if you have questions, remarks, comments, ideas that you'd like to chat with Ed about, please do put those there. And as we get through the chat, we'll call on you, and please then unmute to engage with Ed. So I'm going to turn this over to David now. Please excuse my voice. Welcome again to everyone. If you would, please mute on your bottom left corner of Zoom. And let's get started. So David, Ed, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Erica. Welcome everyone for this necessary conversation. Welcome from snowy Pittsburgh. It just will not become spring here yet. So I hope you're all faring better with the weather. I'm, with a lot of humility, but a great honor for me to introduce Ed Freeman. He really needs no introduction. And please know that this introduction will not do his career justice. Ed is the Olson Professor of Business Administration, the Academic Director of the Business Roundtable Institute for Corporate Ethics, and an Academic Director of the Institute for Business and Society at the Darden School at the University of Virginia. Ed is a prolific writer, philosopher, and publisher, author or editor of over 20 volumes and over 100 articles in the areas of stakeholder management, business strategy, and business ethics. His most famous and cited work is the 1994 book on stakeholder theory.
Let me just quickly ask whoever has the Zoom up, you're controlling the screen sharing. If you could pull that off of the screen share, that would be great. Someone has a Zoom login, I think.
So with Ed's 1984 book on stakeholder management, Ed outlines the idea for the stakeholder idea to a number of different disciplines and suggests that businesses build their strategy around the relationships of key stakeholders, basically turning the shareholder theory of the firm on its head. Ed is the co-editor of the Journal of Business Ethics. He's a Summer Marcus Award winner at the Academy of Management and has received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the World Resources Institute and Aspen Institute, at the Humboldt University Conference on Corporate Social Responsibility and Society for Business Ethics. He's worked with many executives and companies around the world as well, so his work is not just for academics, it's applicable to business professionals around the world. There is no one more cited than Ed in our field. There's actually not even a close second to him. And let me add that that is very well deserved, and I hold Ed in the highest admiration. So with that very brief introduction of Ed, I'd like to turn it over to him and welcome him to our necessary conversation. Ed, could you maybe start us off by first telling us what is the Business Sucks story?
Well, thanks, Dave. It's really great to be here with everybody. A long time ago, I sort of discovered that a lot of people thought business occupied the moral low ground in society. And I never did, in part because I really didn't know anything about business at all. I went to Wharton as a postdoc, but the only reason I went there was because this was 1976. My girlfriend was going to be at Penn, and so I went with my PhD in philosophy, and I just didn't know anything. And so I was trying to give an account of what I saw when I had to start learning something about business. And it seemed to me just incredibly straightforward that here were a bunch of people out creating value for each other, creating value for their stakeholders. And that seemed to be what they were doing. And they didn't get it right all the time, but they didn't get it wrong all the time either. So as I learned more about this, I tried to articulate this idea of, look, business occupies the moral low ground in society. Because I think that's not right, and B, it's actually dangerous, especially when it is in the public policy arena, etc. So the first attempt at this, I remember I spent a week at the beach in I think it was the summer of '94, and I said I'm going to write this book, and I'm going to write this talk as the presidential address. And I'm going to call it the Business Sucks story. And once I did that, it kind of wrote itself. In the beginning, I talk about a colleague of mine who had a seminar on environmentalism and culture back in the early 90s. We had this guy from, I think it was Niagara Power, talking about environmentalism and what Niagara Power was doing. And my colleague was from the humanities, actually, in the literature department, a great guy who I like very, very much. But he says to the guy, so, you're only interested in profits. And so that's not appropriate for scholars. And so, you must give this presentation to business people, but it's not appropriate for scholars. And the guy said, look, I thought we all agreed this is the right thing to do. I'm trying to show you it can be profitable too. And that one encounter kind of crystallized for me that there was something going on with the underlying narrative about business. And this underlying narrative, which I call the Business Sucks story, or cowboy capitalism, or really call it whatever you want, but it's the dominant narrative of business. It's the narrative that, unfortunately, we teach too much of in business schools. And so for a long time, I've tried to figure out, is there a different way to do this?
Ed, can you hold on one second?
Sure.
Ellie Okada, if you can hear me, I hope you can hear me. Can you go to the bottom of your screen and unclick share screen? Bring your cursor all the way down to the bottom, very bottom of your screen. No. Okay, I'm not sure that you can hear me, but at the very bottom of your screen, there's an icon that says share screen. We need you to unclick that. I'm sorry, Ed. We're just trying to. Or Ellie Okada, would you mind logging off and calling back in?
At the bottom of the screen, not the bottom of the window she has open.
Let's see. There we go. Okay, so I hope she'll call back in. Thank you. Okay, Ed, sorry about that.
No, no, that's fine. I was just trying to say where this idea came from. And I never, I wrote this thing, I gave it in Vancouver. I had already given this controversial talk at Social Issues in Management called Let's Disband the Academy of Management. And both of those things, I think people came to me and said, hey, you really told them. And my answer to that was, I'm trying to tell us, not them. A lot's happened since then. A lot's happened that's really good. I think the very emergence of the Humanistic Management Association and the journals and those kinds of things, those are all really positive things. But also, there's a lot that hasn't changed. I mean, I think this idea that the dominant narrative is that business is about profits, it's about the money. It's certainly in the culture. It brought us the global financial crisis. It's bringing us what I think is a crisis in business schools, because honestly, we need to teach a different narrative now. Now, let me say that, and to be sure there's no misunderstanding, I'm not trying to argue that profits aren't important, that money's not important. Of course it is. But the analogy is, making red blood cells is important. Nobody wants on their tombstone made red blood cells. The idea here is that business is about purpose. It's about ethics and values. It's about stakeholders and their interdependence. It's about being set within society, not outside of society. And that's what business people really do. And that's what this new narrative of business is gonna require. We're trying to write a book now that's tentatively called Business, the New Story, with Bobby Parmar and Kirsten Martin, who some of you know. And hopefully we're going to get that finished. What we're trying to do is say, what are the 6 or 8 underlying principles in all these movements that you see? And I ultimately don't care what the brand is at the end, but I'm pretty sure I know what that brand's got to be a part of. It's got to be, we got to change the unit of analysis. So it's stakeholders, relationships, not transactions, and relationships that aren't reducible to a set of transactions. We've got to put ethics and values and purpose in the center, just like profits are today. We have to pay attention to the physical embeddedness of business. That's the best way I can think about environment, is to think, look, there's laws of physics aren't just a good idea, they're the law. And so we have to pay attention to what that is. We have to pay attention to what's a human being. I think it's disrespectful to think about human beings as one-dimensional maximizers of their short-term self-interest. We do have people like that. Some of them are in high positions, but we also know what people who maximize their short-term self-interest are called. We generally call them sociopaths. And so, and there are a couple of other principles that are around. I won't bore you with all of those things, but you look at what's going on. Inclusive capitalism, conscious capitalism, more humanistic management, renewed interest in corporate social responsibility and sustainability, just business, the incredible number of students who want to be social entrepreneurs, what's it called? Impact investing, socially responsible investing. There are 25 of these movements, and those are just the ones with where the names are in English that I can understand. I also know there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who want to be social entrepreneurs in Thailand, in India, in Indonesia, in China. And so with all of this going on, what we have to articulate is this new story, this new narrative, because narratives in social science are, we enact our narrative. If I teach a narrative that business and ethics don't mix, that business ethics a contradiction or a short course or whatever your favorite joke is, then the students are going to go out and enact that narrative, just like they will enact the narrative of agency theory or of perfect capital markets or whatever the stuff is that we teach. That's the way social science works, right? Human beings are storytellers. We enact our stories. We can only live the lives that we can imagine through our stories, and we need to articulate this new story and articulate in lots of different ways. I don't care how it ends up, as long as there's some idea that there are some common principles to this, just like there are common principles to the old narrative. So that's kind of the sort of basic argument here that I've been trying to work on. I guess I've been trying to work on it for 40 years, and I guess that makes me kind of a one-trick pony. So,
well, that's certainly not the case. But
no, I think it is. It's actually a pretty good trick, but
well, it's a valuable trick. One thing that occurs to me is, what do you think our responsibility as academics, but also as business professionals, is to institute this new narrative?
Well, I think it's large within the context, of course, of what the university life is. We need to teach it, but we need to critique it. We need to make it better. We have a principle here at Darden that we try to teach the students that says you critique through creation. You want to critique something, then figure out something that's better. I think ultimately that critique through creating is a fundamental principle of business and capitalism. And it's also a fundamental principle of democratic society. And that's the kind of thing that we need. I reject the idea, as you can imagine, that we're just teaching students the skills they want. I think, we have a responsibility for what we teach, and at least partial responsibility. Students are responsible too for how that gets used. I don't think we can escape that role as professors. Now, I'm not saying this in any ideological sense, because again, this process of critical thinking, of trying stuff, figuring out what works, keeping what works, abandoning what doesn't, which is the hallmark of what John Dewey would have said was the scientific method. I think that's just as important in philosophy and humanistic disciplines as it is in science. Not what people think the scientific method is, about hypotheses and data and all that sort of stuff. It's this experimental frame of mind that Dewey talked about, which I think is really so important. So the problem, let me say one more thing. I think the problem in a lot of business schools, and I don't know to what extent it's a problem in the schools of the people that are listening, but part of the problem is a lot of business school professors really don't care very much about business. They care more about their disciplines. I've often thought that if you start something with, well, what problem are we trying to solve? I think unfortunately today in business schools, a lot of professors are trying to solve the problem of, how do I get something published in an A journal? And ultimately, and I'm saying this as a journal editor, that's not a very useful problem to tackle. In the midst of incredible disruptive technologies, I actually think business schools are in danger of becoming irrelevant.
Well, sort of building on that, and I'm going to take a question a little bit out of order here because it builds on what you're just saying. David Jacobs asks, what does it mean to teach a different narrative? And Tariq asks, also sort of building on that question, what's needed for someone that's new to business ethics and business and society fields in developing the knowledge of the new story so they can actually give it to the students?
Well, I think there are lots of ways. Again, my tendency is to start with the phenomena. And that's in part idiosyncratic because that's what I did, of trying to really understand what's going on when you walk into one of these companies that's trying to enact this new narrative. And it doesn't matter whether it's Unilever or Whole Foods or a social entrepreneur in Indonesia. These folks are trying to change the world. They're not in it just to make money. Look, making money is important. Nothing wrong with that. But they're trying to figure out how to change the world. And I think that's a better way to understand what capitalism does. So I don't think it's a complicated thing. But the narrative, the tricky part in teaching is, again, a lot of our teaching material is based on, okay, look, the common narrative is business sucks. Now let's tack on some ethics so it doesn't suck too badly. And, you need different examples. We need different examples to teach with. We need to get entrepreneurs who are starting different businesses into our classrooms. And they're all over the world. Wherever you are, there are folks out there trying to do this. It's also tricky because what I try and get the students to do is to say, look, you need to figure out in your own mind what makes a great business, what makes a business successful. You need to build your own theory of what makes a business successful, why the world works the way it does, and what makes people tick. And if we get students engaged in doing that for themselves, I think that's about as much as you can do as a teacher. And then we can all figure out new ways to sort of talk about this new narrative, new ways to, and I feel a little bad here because it's not really new at all. It's been around a long, long, long time. In fact, look, human beings have been cooperating together to create value for each other ever since we decided to specialize labor. I've often taken my iPhone and held it up to students. So what is this iPhone thing? And I think this articulates the new narrative in a way that also makes it very old. What this iPhone is some bits of metal, some bits of sand, and the fact that we can invent solutions to our problems. We can cooperate together to do that. Think of the kinds of problems we had to solve to get to an iPhone. We had to solve, for instance, what's metal? How do you make glass? How do you invent a physics that made semiconductors possible, etc.? We've had to solve a lot of problems over a long time. And we have to cooperate together to produce this. And when you come to see human beings as language-using cooperators who can invent solutions to their problems, you come to see the world as a world of abundance, not as a world of scarcity. And I think that goes along with this.
So this goes to George's question. Is there a unifying principle that all of us can strive to achieve or uphold that would actually get us all to go towards the same goal?
Well, again, I'm absolutely biased on this. I think once we start down the road of using the language of stakeholders, and you see now stakeholder relationships, and a relationship is not reducible to just a set of economic transactions. As anyone who's ever been in love or been married or had a serious relationship with another human being knows, there's a presumption that it continues. There's a presumption of caring. There's a presumption that it's built on some notion of ethics and values. Once we start to see business as relational in this way, and can look at all the effects of what business does, and that's all the stakeholder idea does, then I think we'll figure out, different and more useful ways to talk about business.
There was an early question from Elaine. Do you view the recent emergence of B Corps and teal organizations as a step in the direction you're pointing to?
Well, that's a really great question. For a long time, I thought B Corps were okay, but we didn't need them. In the U.S., as Lynn Stout's shown again and again, we don't have, directors don't have a duty to maximize the interest of shareholders. They just don't. That's not the law. On the other hand, some of the governance mechanisms and rules we've adopted allow short sellers and others to really harm companies that are high purpose and high profit companies. And so I've kind of rethought about this, and I now think B Corps may well be necessary, or at least we've got to figure out how, if I buy 7% of a company, which happened recently, of a very high purpose, high profit company, and I just put pressure on them to sacrifice the basic business model of the company, which is a stakeholder model, to increase returns to shareholders in the next year. I think that's destructive. Those governance mechanisms that allow that destroy value. There are lots of policy ways to deal with that. B Corp is one. I'm a little afraid, however, of part of the B Corp issue is there's a sense that purpose matters so much that you don't have to be profitable, and that to me is the death knell. Because if I don't have red blood cells,
So there's a comment here from John that I think would be a good next step here for our questions and discussion. That we have a lot of like-minded people with the same goal here on this call. So the thought is that we're all part of the same choir.
Yeah.
How do you get people in accounting and finance and economics to be on the same page with this idea of a new narrative?
Well, I think that's tricky because, again, certainly in the academic world, there's so much skepticism. I mean, we still suffer under this thing I called the separation fallacy, which is that business and ethics don't mix, that there are no value questions in science and social science. I mean, that's so wrong as to actually be laughable in a way. My favorite story about that is 1944. Enrico Fermi and his colleagues are about to detonate the Chicago pile, the world's first nuclear reaction, chain reaction. And there was, it turned out in the math, a small non-zero probability that the atmosphere would turn to sand. And Fermi and his colleagues, did the experiment anyway. Supposedly they were laughing and joking about it. Now, obviously the probability was very, very, very tiny. And again, I don't know enough physics to know whether that's still the accepted theory or not. But they had to figure out in doing the experiment, and that's what scientists really do, they learn how to do things. They had to decide, they had to make a moral judgment here as to whether this experiment should go on. Now, if there's moral judgments in physics, certainly there's moral judgments in economics, which we know, And by the time you get down to accounting and finance and management, I mean, come on. So there's this, there's this, call it physics envy of, the marketing people want to be, or let's say the manager people want to be marketing people, who want to be economists, who want to be uh, uh, physicists. And that hierarchy of disciplines, I think, is problematic. So look, I'm a philosophical pragmatist. I don't think there's a difference in kind between science, between physics and poetry. There's a difference in what we kind of agree on, and how much agreement is there. But there's not a difference in kind here. So we need to get off this. My discipline's better than yours. It's harder. It has bigger data. That sort of stuff. I find that stuff pretty amusing here.
So there's a sentiment that if you're going to try to create these
Can I
moral, sure, sorry.
I see something from Roland that I just want to.
Yeah, that's what I was going to address next. Yes,
Okay,
the
yeah.
question.
So you go ahead.
No, Roland's question is if there can only be a moral business if there are moral leaders. So is that the approach we should be taking at a sort of a ground level?
Okay. Yeah, that was not the Roland question I was going to talk about for a second. I mean, yes, we need to look. Leadership needs to be imbued with morality as well. There's a note from him that says when you add social to it.
Yes.
So when you add social to Marktwirtschaft, or you add social to entrepreneurship, you add social to responsibility, you automatically embrace the business success story because you got to add social to it, and I think the definition between the distinction, the dichotomy of economic and social is really not a very useful one. Every sort of purely economic action has social consequences as well, and social consequences have economic consequences as well. So the social economic divide, like the business and ethics divide, is one of those dichotomies that drive pragmatists like me crazy. Is Bill Gates a social entrepreneur? Well, I know he changed society. I know he made money, of course, but every entrepreneur makes money. We have a saying in the music business goes like this: everybody got to get paid, because if you don't, you can't continue. And so I don't see any difference in that. Sorry, you talk about something else, David.
Well, no, but building on that, I mean, is it a matter of getting over the assumptions that we're just rationally self-interested? And is it opposed to this social nature? Can we be self-interested and social? I like to think we can.
Well, of course we are. We're at once self-interested and other regarding. I mean, we're complicated.
Yeah.
And we need to, and that's why, by the way, business works. It works because of our complexity. Look, when I travel, I don't want to listen to everybody's music. I want to listen to mine. I couldn't do that before Sony invented the Walkman, and Steve Jobs made it available to everybody, and Spotify made it free. But this idea that we take contradictory things and put them together is in part what business is really good at. And so, we have to get past this idea that we have to be self-interested. Of course, we can be self-interested. But again, anybody who's ever been in love knows we're incredibly other regarding, or who's had a child knows we're incredibly other regarding. We're at once capable of greed, of love, of many different behaviors and emotions. And the reduction of this is the way it has to be in business is, to my mind, just it's there's a scientist by the name, I think it was Paul Dirac, who would often say that's not even wrong, and that's what I would say about that.
I think the answer to this would be you are going to agree with this idea, but Adele had asked a question here about she's in the decision analysis and support areas, management sciences, computer sciences. And she says that she agrees with your position that the economy is a social construct and that the corporation are social enterprises. So she talks about the enacting of stakeholder capitalism, requiring a better understanding of decision-making within large, diverse groups of organizations. Do you agree with this idea of connecting them through these global supply chains and value transformation that she suggests?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's a great set of questions to work on. It's not the only set of questions to work on, but it is a terrific one. Global value chains are real. I was at a meeting just last week, and people were talking about the effect of the Chinese government trying to crack down on pollution, the effects of that on an industry that's five times removed from that, because part of the crackdown is involving plants that make vitamins, and this leads to a vitamin shortage in certain industries, etc. So yeah, I mean, we have to do that. We have to look at stakeholders in this sort of large global value chain. I'm probably more skeptical than Adele is of a couple of distinctions. I don't think the value capture, value distribution distinction is as interesting as some people think. I think as you get close to a sort of Pareto frontier where it's win-lose, that's the place where we reinvent the payoff space. And I think that's not well understood yet. I'm also a little, I'm not, I think it's a little tricky to talk about social construction. Ian Hacking, a philosopher, wrote a book called The Social Construction of What? Look, language is social. I've yet to find anything that's not a social construction. It's, again, one of those ideas where once you put social in front of it, you automatically buy into that there's something else that's not like that. And so I've never been much of a fan of that. Having said that, I think these questions about multi-criteria decision making, etc. That's kind of what I started off doing way back in the 70s. I think these are still really important questions, especially thinking about value change. I like to think about value change. One of the things we say to our students is, look, you can call this the value chain. I'm going to call it the responsibility chain. Why are cigarette manufacturers bad, but tobacco farmers are good? What's the reason for drawing the line? It's not a where you draw the line question. It's what's the logic for drawing it here versus here? And I think there's a lot of really interesting work to be done on that. Work that I hope shows up in the Journal of Business Ethics, of course.
Yeah, this is actually quite important work. Ed, there seems to be a couple questions that are asking you to expand a little bit. One thing asking about instilling ethical values in business that is suggested are at variance with ethical values in society. And then Greg asking a follow-up question saying, why are the economy and societies, why aren't they distinct? Or is this something that the values in both are the same? And how do we get our heads around bringing, viewing the values of business the values of society as being one and the same.
Well, I don't think there's a set. Let me deal with the last question first, Greg. I don't think there's a particular way of carving up the world that what Dick Rorty would say carves the world at the joints. There are lots of vocabularies. A certain vocabulary might be useful for solving a certain kind of problem. The problem, the issue becomes when we take one particular vocabulary, like the vocabulary of neoclassical economics, and we make it solve all possible problems. It's not to say that there aren't some useful insights when Gary Becker uses that to talk to us about love and marriage and family. There can be. But there are lots of other vocabularies that are useful here as well. And so I'm trying to argue here, essentially what I would say is the vocabularies of philosophy and literature and history and law and economics are very useful in understanding how we create value and trade with each other. To take there are very few people. There are a few, like Julie Nelson at the University of Massachusetts, who wrote this great little book called Economics for Humans. There are very few economists who want to think about humans in this kind of complex relational sense. It's not because they're bad people. It's just because, in a way, they want to say, look, even if we're greedy little bastards trying to do each other in, we can still get cooperative behavior together. That's the beauty of something like John Nash's game theoretic view, and that's useful. We just need to understand it for what it is, rather than as a sort of universal acid that we can pour on anything to dissolve it. So that's why economy and society, to even use that language is to pick a vocabulary that may try to solve some problems, but not others. I also, of course, Greg is right. It's around, if you had to make rational in some pure utility maximizing sense of scarce resources, it would be useful. I think that itself is not always an interesting problem, because, as I said earlier, I think once we see ourselves as able to invent vocabularies to solve our problems, and that's what our history is, then essentially the world's a world of abundance. It's the only limits are the limits to our imagination and the laws of physics. So that's just a different way to think about. Doesn't make anybody wrong. It's just a different way to say, well, let's try some other vocabularies and see what could be useful here. Now, David, you have to remind me, as I've gotten old, of the first question before that, because I don't see it on my screen here.
Oh, I think you addressed it in the bigger narrative that you had. So I think I'd like to move on to a question that seems to be, a couple of people are asking a question that overlap. You had mentioned barriers that need to be overcome already. And Vanessa's asking, what barriers must business schools overcome to adopt the narrative for business that you're talking about? But also, sort of a part of a larger question, how do we make this part of the mainstream?
Yeah, so I don't really, look, I think it depends. I have the best job in the world. Ethics at Darden is a background discipline. It's been that way since long before I got here. So I don't spend any time legitimizing doing ethics. And I know that a lot of people who are on this call do. They have to spend time actually, legitimizing doing what they're doing. I've taught courses here. I do a course on theater, one on music, one with literature. My job is to sort of do the humanities at the business school. and I've taught strategy and other things as well, but there's an openness to ideas from lots of different disciplines that I don't always find at other schools. So we will jointly teach with our colleagues in finance and accounting and operations in our ethics course. And we do that a lot. I'm not trying to say we do everything right. There's a lot that we don't, but there's an openness to that. The second thing is, so in the teaching and the students, they see this as business as a more holistic enterprise than as a set of transactions to maximize profits. Also, what we try to do is we're a school that's a reading school. So when somebody's up for promotion, we actually read what they've written. That's not to say we discount so-called A journals, but we don't have a list. And we don't have actually departments. Everybody here is a professor of business administration. And so if I'm on the promotion and tenure committee, I have to read stuff in finance and accounting and all of that, or at least try to. So what we got to get away from is this mania for A journals. You know, it only counts if it's in finance. They have 3 journals, and if it's not in those 3 journals, it doesn't count. Now, the idea that, you know, let's say Aristotle didn't publish in the right journal, and therefore what Aristotle said wasn't very useful, or Dewey or Rorty. I mean, that's a ridiculous idea to a philosopher, that where something's published is an indication of its truth, if you're a positivist, or its usefulness, if you're a pragmatist. It's not. The ideas stand and fall on their own. And we just have got to get, unfortunately, I think that game is already lost. And you hear it if you go to meetings and you listen to young scholars talk. They rarely, they don't talk about their ideas. They talk about how many R&Rs they have and what journals. And I think we've got to figure out, and Vanessa, I wish I had a better answer than this. You know, we got to figure that out. The only thing I try to do is to just work on the ideas and let that other stuff sort of fall where. Now that's easy for me to say. I'm at a point in my career I don't have to worry about tenure or that sort of stuff. And I couldn't get tenure at a school today for sure, because I wrote a book, and you weren't supposed to write books. Now the irony is, of course, is I didn't know that. It's in philosophy, you have to write books. So I wrote this book, and it was just luck that somebody took a chance and gave me tenure. So I just think that's a hard thing to figure out how to do it. You got to focus on. The only advice I have is you just got to focus on what you have passion for. I don't think there's, and maybe some schools will figure it out. Maybe some people will figure it out. At least I hope so. Of course, the other thing to do is to join the disruptors. I mean, I did this massive open online course on new models of business, and I probably had 100,000 people sign up for it. So there are ways to get around the system. How you monetize those and commercialize them, I don't really have any idea.
There's a question, Ed, that I think is a nice seg into our theme with humanistic management and sort of its role in creating the new narrative, because I know that's something that Erica, Michael, and others in our group are desperately trying to do. There's a question about being in a group where each of the members of the group may have a different value set. Is the one binding value that could get everyone to pursue the same productive narrative he's centered around empathy, and empathy being a big part of humanistic management. Do you think empathy is kind of a key to establish this social narrative?
Well, I don't know. I think that's another great question. I tend to think that we're not as different as we think. Empathy is important, but if you actually ask people in some very diverse settings all over the world, if you ask them, um, write down the top 3 values that you want to teach your children. Or if you don't have kids, write down the top 3 values you really wish other people would teach their children. You know, they all pretty much write down the same thing. It's respect, it's integrity, it's responsibility, it's empathy or caring for others. It's some version of those things, no matter if they're in Jakarta or if they're in Charlottesville. So I tend to think because we live in an individualistic society, we focus on individual difference. But the truth is, as human beings, we have a lot in common. In fact, we couldn't have accomplished what we've accomplished, both good and bad, if we didn't have those things in common. Michael Tomasello thinks that evolution actually selects for good cooperators. And that over the generations, the millennia, we've evolved precisely because we really know how to cooperate for each other. With each other. I would add that we really know what caring and love is, or empathy, if you want, as well. So I think there's a set of values which makes us human. I don't think there's only one set. I think if you look at some of the stuff that tries to say, well, it's these values versus those. I'm not sure about that, but I am sure there's a lot of agreement about what that is. Now, look, it's different to show respect in Jakarta than it is in Charlottesville. There's not a difference in values; it's a difference in culture. And so oftentimes what masquerades as value differences are simply cultural differences, which are important, and they're important to understand. But if you think there's a lot of value congruence, then you need to have a conversation. Versus, I think the way our political system in a number of places around the world see it is, whenever there's a difference, we see it as a conversation stopper. And we start calling each other names, and that's not very useful.
No, that's not productive at all. We need to have more conversations like this in different contexts. We are down to last 7 or 8 minutes, and I want to give Ed an opportunity to make some final wrap-up comments. And I apologize; there've been just a
great
bombardment of questions that we're just not going to be able to get to all at the moment. But there seems to be interest in Clark's question that I think would be a good time to ask now. That if you look at the history of corporate governance in the United States, it's relatively brief, and that this whole shareholder primacy view of the firm was just one narrative, as you suggested too. Is it possible to argue that this shareholder primacy is, and in its current form, just the latest fad or the latest narrative, so people can view it as something that is evolving and not stoic?
Yeah, I couldn't have said that better myself. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. When history is written in 100 years, people will say, "Gee, how do they ever believe that paying attention only to shareholders made any sense at all?" Now, the problem here is that business as an academic discipline, the business disciplines are ahistorical. I don't know how many of you out there have historians on your business school faculty. We have none. And the other places I've taught, Minnesota and Wharton, had none. And oftentimes the business history that gets written from the standpoint of the business success story. Suppose we saw business as how human beings cooperate together to create value for its stakeholders, and sometimes destroy that value. I'm not suggesting that's not there. How would we write history? So I think we need some new narrative historians, because it's not really new. We need some historians who understand not that business sucks, but that people are complicated, that business creates and sometimes destroys value as well. And I kind of wonder what history of business would look like there. I'm worried we'll never have that, because there are really very few business historians at business schools now. But I think Clark is absolutely right. I think the shareholder value thing, well, I don't know if it's a fad. It was. I mean, it's damaging, and it's damaging to people who actually want to do the right thing for shareholders. And we'll come to see that eventually.
So I'm seeing a good sort of larger question that might be a good way of getting towards us wrapping up our time today. Robin Derry asks a question about irresponsible individuals, and that I'd agree. I think a lot of our business ethics texts are framed around, the bad apples and poor individual level decision making. So if we're concerned about making business not suck, do we skip over our current systems of production, underpaid labor, social well-being? I guess it speaks to a question of addressing all the levels of analysis here, not just the individual level, but the organizational and systemic level. Is it possible to change the narrative at all three?
Well, I think that's right. Look, my view is not that all businesses don't suck. My view is that there are a lot of them that don't. For every Enron, there are 10,000 companies out there just trying to do the right thing. That doesn't minimize the damage that's done. In fact, it works the other way. If I think all businesses suck, then why would I worry about Enron? They're all like this. I think we need a more nuanced view of this, and we certainly need to call out practices and systems of production that are exploitative, systems that use underpaid labor and don't think about well-being. I mean, I think it's absolutely immoral that 70+% of employees go to work every day. They're unengaged or actively unengaged in their work. That's immoral. And it speaks to me of a vacuum in the idea of what leadership in business turns out to be. So I think that's right. The point of the Business Such story was to say, look, there is this narrative that kind of all business sucks. And I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical of the damage. I'm skeptical of the narrative because I think it's damaging. It keeps us from calling out people that do bad stuff, and it keeps us also from calling out people that do good stuff. What I've often said to executives is, look, I just want to bring you some news of a real ethics issue that's come to my attention. And then I say, how many of you thought that, wow, he's going to tell us about something really cool that made the world a better place? And the answer is no one, because we see ethics issues as bad stuff. But wait a minute. I think there's some, if you're going to give me credit for the bad stuff, you got to give me credit for the good that happens along with it too. And so we need a more careful, more nuanced view about what business ethics is, it seems to me.
Well, Ed, we are about out of time on our scheduled hour, and I wanted to give you a chance to make a final comment, but I should alert you to the fact that there were dozens of other questions that we just could not get to in a variety of different ways. I think there are several people that are interested in your advice on running their doctoral student career and your advice on publishing and things like that too. So I see another necessary conversation in the future on the horizon here.
Well, I'm happy to do that. I really enjoyed this. I haven't had time to read all the chat stuff. This is my experience with doing these things has always been that the chat comments weren't very helpful, and that's certainly not true today. I want to go back and read these, and look, I try and answer all my emails. So if somebody has something that they want to talk about, send me an email. I'm pretty easy to find. It's Freeman E at darden.virginia.edu, and I'm happy to try to be as helpful as I can.
Well, I can certainly attest to that. Ed has always been extremely accessible and kind and gracious to me throughout my whole career. So I really do appreciate that, and I won't forget it. I don't know, Erica or Michael, do you want to say any final comments here to the group on behalf of the IHMA?
I'm not even sure if I have a voice after that. But again, many, many thanks to all. Ed, thank you so much for joining. We have a lot of events coming up and initiatives through the IHMA. We invite you to join us in any capacity that might make sense for you, whether it's a publishing or a set of activities. We're associated with Prime. We have a pre-conference at Academy. We know there's a Journal of Business Ethics, and we love to publish there. And we also have the Humanistic Management Journal that is very, very open to exactly this conversation. And also some special edited volumes coming up. So please, please stay tuned, stay engaged. We so appreciate these types of conversations with everyone. Michael, did you want to add anything further?
No, just thank you. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, David. Thank you, Ed, for doing this. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Thanks a lot. And looking forward to another one.
And this will be made available on the site. So we hope you get to listen to it again and we can get more insights from it. And there's some good links being provided by the participants here too. So I invite you all to check those out as well. But thank you so much, Ed.
We'll capture the chat as well. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.